Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk. So, how's everything going in your world? Anything crazy happening lately? Anything making you go, "Huh, that's weird"? Or
Well, no major spills or anything like that, thankfully. But I did get into a pretty heated debate with my neighbor about the right way to prune roses. Turns out people have some pretty strong opinions about gardening.
Oh yeah, for sure.
How about you? Did you ever conquer that shelf you were working on? Or is it still winning the battle?
Oh man, that shelf is a whole saga, let me tell you. Let's just say it's leaning at a very interesting angle right now. I'm calling it like modern art. Deconstructed shelving.
I like it.
It's a conversation starter, at least. But hey, speaking of conversation starters, we got to talk about Taiwan again, right?
Yeah.
Last time we did this deep dive, we were talking about Lai Ching-te.
Yeah.
Calling China an external hostile force.
Right.
That's pretty straight to the point.
Yeah, no mincing words there.
Definitely got people's attention.
It did as you'd expect.
Big time. So you sent me a ton of stuff to read about it. Articles, looking at Taiwan's side of things, and then some real deep analysis of what China's saying, and even some stuff about free speech for people who aren't citizens, both in Taiwan and here in the U.S. So today, our mission, if we choose to accept it, is to really figure out how China reacted to that whole hostile force thing.
Okay.
What are they saying about it? Does it even make sense? What are they trying to do? And then how is Taiwan handling all this? You ready to do some digging?
I'm ready. Let's get into it.
All right. So first things first, let's talk about Taiwan.
Okay.
See all these headlines about military exercises and China talking tough. But what's it actually like over there? You were saying the sources paint a different picture than what some people might think.
Yeah, you're right. The general feeling in Taiwan, from what I've read, is that all those military moves, the ships, the exercises, those simulated bombing runs, and even those really strong statements from Beijing, they aren't just random acts or just some crazy dictator, trying to scare everyone. It goes deeper than that. The overwhelming view in Taiwan is that this is a very deliberate strategy, a step-by-step effort to chip away at their sovereignty and their ability to make their own choices as a democracy.
So it's not just about intimidation then?
I mean, intimidation is definitely a part of it, but Taiwan's official stance is that these actions are attacks on democracy itself and that they pose a real danger to the stability of the whole region. Lai Ching-te, he echoed that in his inaugural address earlier this year. That's when he called China that external hostile force. He's basically saying that Beijing is actively trying to destabilize and coerce Taiwan.
And what is Taiwan actually doing about it? They're not just sitting there taking it, are they?
Oh, definitely not. They're taking it very seriously and beefing up their military readiness.
Yeah.
Big time. For instance, back in October, we saw a record-breaking number of Chinese military aircraft, 66 to be exact, crossing that median line in the Taiwan Strait. And it wasn't just a one-time thing either. They've increased their defense budget for 2025 to NT $645 billion. That's about 2.5% of their entire GDP. It's a clear message that they're prioritizing their defense in response to all this pressure from China.
That's a serious amount of money. Are they also trying to get other countries on their side?
Absolutely. They're actively seeking international support. They've been vocal about their appreciation for the U.S. providing defensive weapons under the Taiwan Relations Act. And they're also having more security dialogues with key partners in the region like Japan and Australia. They're trying to make it clear that China's actions aren't just a problem for Taiwan. They're a problem for the whole Indo-Pacific.
Makes that safety in numbers right.
Yeah.
But what about the average person in Taiwan? How are they reacting to all of this? Are they terrified?
It's interesting. The dominant feeling among the Taiwanese public seems to be more like they're being bullied rather than outright terror. There was poll data from 2024 showing that a large majority, something like 68%, see China's actions as a threat to democracy.
Wow.
And more than half support increased defense spending. But here's the thing, more than 60% said they're not afraid of Chinese military pressure.
That's some serious resilience.
It really is. And in a way, all this pressure from China is actually having the opposite effect of what they probably want. It's strengthening Taiwanese identity.
Really?
Yeah, there are surveys from NCCU, a university in Taiwan, showing that after the recent elections, over 70% of people identify as Taiwanese. They see those military exercises like Joint Sword 2024B, where they simulated a blockade as acts of bullying that just make them feel more distinctly Taiwanese.
So life just goes on as normal, even when these drills are happening.
That's what people on the ground are saying. The news in Taiwan has reported that during those Chinese military exercises, life in the big cities like Taipei just continued as usual. People went to work, met friends, ran errands. There wasn't widespread panic or anything like that. It seems like they've gotten used to this kind of pressure, almost like it's background noise now.
So they're just tuning it out?
Yeah.
What are the experts in Taiwan saying about all this?
The experts, the scholars and military analysts, they tend to see China's actions as having two sides to them. There's the psychological warfare aspect and then the actual preparation for a potential conflict.
Okay.
So Su Ziyun from INDSR, a think tank in Taiwan, he says that the goal of the psychological warfare is to create uncertainty and doubt both within Taiwan and internationally about whether Taiwan can really survive in the long run. They want to erode confidence, but he doesn't think it's working very well.
Why not?
He says it's because of Taiwan's resilience and because they have support from other countries, especially the U.S. Now, on the military side, Lin Yingyu, a Taiwanese military expert, says that China is increasing their capabilities in what's called gray zone warfare.
Gray zone warfare, what's that?
Gray zone warfare is basically actions that put a lot of pressure on a country but don't actually cross the line into a full-blown military attack. Things like cyber attacks, economic pressure, and increasing their military presence in international waters.
Oh, I see.
Lin doesn't think China is about to launch a full-scale war right now, but he says they're definitely getting ready for it.
So how is Taiwan responding to this two-pronged approach from China? What's their game plan?
Their strategy is focused on something called asymmetric warfare, which basically means using their strengths to exploit their opponent's weaknesses. This involves developing weapons that can effectively deter a much larger force, like highly mobile precision missiles and advanced drones. They're also focusing on getting regular people ready for a potential conflict through civil defense training. That's a major part of their comprehensive defense mobilization plan, which they launched in 2024.
Okay, so they're preparing for the worst, but hoping for the best.
Right.
And what does Taiwan think China's ultimate goal is with all of this? What are they really trying to accomplish?
Well, from Taiwan's perspective, China has a few key objectives. First, they want to change the status quo in the Taiwan Strait and force the world to accept their one China principle. That's their policy that says Taiwan is a part of China and there's only one China. Those military exercises in October 2024, a lot of people saw them as a direct response to Lai Ching-te's statements after he became president. Beijing saw those statements as moving further away from the idea of one China and closer to the idea of two states.
So they're trying to push their own narrative.
Exactly. The second objective is to create more unity within mainland China by getting everyone to rally against this idea of Taiwan independence. At the same time, they're trying to isolate Taiwan internationally, making it harder for them to have relationships with other countries. And finally, Taiwan sees these actions as a way for China to test their military and see how determined the Taiwanese people are to resist.
You mentioned something interesting earlier about young people in Taiwan being more willing to participate in civil defense training.
Yeah.
What was that about?
Yeah, that was really surprising. In 2024, there was a big jump in the number of young people, those between 18 and 34, who said they'd be willing to take part in civil defense training. It went up to 45% from just 32% 2 years earlier.
Why?
It seems like instead of being scared or intimidated, a lot of young people in Taiwan are actually getting more proactive and preparing for a potential conflict.
That's pretty impressive. All right. So we've talked about how Taiwan sees things. Now let's shift gears and look at what China's been saying officially in response to Lai Ching-te's external hostile force label. What were their main points, and where do we see some inconsistencies in their messaging?
Well, Lai Ching-te calling China an external hostile force, that was a big deal. It was a direct challenge to Beijing's narrative, and it put them in a tough spot. Their official responses are pretty interesting because they reveal some pretty big contradictions.
Okay, let's hear them.
So the first one is this idea that Taiwan has no president. They keep saying this even though Taiwan clearly has democratic elections. I mean, it's just logic. If Taiwan has no president, then what were all those political parties, the DPP, the KMT, and the others, what were they campaigning for back in January? Why did millions of Taiwanese citizens go out and vote?
Yeah, it doesn't really add up.
Exactly. China is trying to undermine Taiwan's sovereignty by refusing to acknowledge their democratically elected leader. But the reality is that Taiwan has a functioning government and an electoral process that many countries around the world recognize. China's narrative can't change that.
What's the next contradiction?
The second one is their claim that only a few die-hard Taiwan independence elements are pushing for separation from China. But that doesn't really match up with the fact that the Democratic Progressive Party, which supports a more distinct Taiwanese identity, has won 3 presidential elections in a row. If independence was really just a fringe idea supported by a small minority, then how could the DPP keep winning? And we've also seen declining support for the Kuomintang, which favors closer ties with China. So it seems like they're trying to downplay the fact that public opinion in Taiwan is shifting.
You're trying to make it seem like it's just a few troublemakers.
Right. They're personalizing the issue instead of acknowledging that there's a broader change happening in how Taiwanese people see themselves and their future. The polls show that most Taiwanese people either want to keep things the way they are, or they identify more strongly as Taiwanese rather than wanting to be part of China.
What's the final contradiction?
The last one is the contrast between China's aggressive language and their image as a responsible world power. They say things like playing with fire will lead to self-immolation and that Taiwan is on a dead-end path if they don't move towards unification. But at the same time, they want to be seen as a peaceful and benevolent global leader. It's like they're having a temper tantrum on the world stage.
Kind of.
They're trying to scare Taiwan and discourage them from pursuing independence or policies that China doesn't like. But as we've already talked about, this kind of aggressive approach often backfires. It just makes Taiwanese people dislike China even more, and it pushes them to strengthen their defenses and seek more support from other countries. So it makes you wonder if this strategy is really working for them in the long run.
So if these narratives are so full of holes, what's the point of them? What's China hoping to achieve by pushing them so hard?
Even though their narratives have contradictions, they still serve a few important purposes for China. First of all, it's about internal propaganda. They need to keep pushing this anti-Taiwan independence message to prevent people in China from questioning their policies on Taiwan. It's also a way to distract people from problems within China, like economic issues or social unrest.
So it's about control.
Exactly. They need to keep people focused on an external enemy to maintain unity and stability at home. The second purpose is to influence how the rest of the world sees the situation with Taiwan. They want to convince everyone that Taiwan independence is only supported by a small minority and that most Taiwanese people actually want unification. This can weaken international support for Taiwan and make it harder for them to get help from other countries. And the third goal is to use psychological warfare against Taiwan. By creating this constant atmosphere of fear and instability, they hope to undermine support for independence within Taiwan itself. The goal is to make people afraid to speak out against China and to discourage them from supporting policies that China doesn't like.
It's a pretty sophisticated strategy, even if it's based on some shaky narratives. So how is Taiwan fighting back against this?
They're using a multi-pronged approach. First, they're strengthening their relationships with other democratic countries like the US, Japan, and European nations. They're working hard to build alliances and emphasize their shared values. Second, they're investing in their own defense. They're modernizing their military and beefing up their cybersecurity to protect themselves from Chinese interference. And third, they're working to tell their own story to the world. They're engaging with international media and using cultural diplomacy to present themselves as a vibrant democracy that deserves support.
So it's about fighting back with facts, building strong alliances, and telling your own story. Now, you sent me some really interesting articles about freedom of speech and the deportation of foreigners, specifically about Taiwan deporting a PRC spouse and the U.S. potentially deporting a green card holder. How do these cases connect to our discussion about Taiwan and China?
These cases are a perfect example of how complicated the issue of free speech can be, especially when it comes to non-citizens. They raise some really important questions about whether people who aren't citizens have the same right to free speech as citizens do, and whether that right should be limited if their views threaten the country they're living in.
And it sounds like the sources are saying that freedom of speech isn't unlimited, especially for non-citizens.
Exactly. Freedom of speech is a fundamental right in a democracy, but there are limits. It generally doesn't protect speech that incites violence, tries to overthrow the government, or endangers national security. This is recognized in international law and in the laws of many countries.
So how do these specific cases fit into that?
Well, in Taiwan, they have laws like the National Security Act and the Immigration Act that allow the government to restrict the speech of foreigners if it threatens national security or public order. In the case of that PRC spouse who was deported for supporting the forceful unification of Taiwan that was seen as a direct threat to Taiwan's democracy and security. Similarly, in the U.S., the First Amendment protects free speech, but it's not absolute. You can't advocate for illegal activities like the violent overthrow of the government or support designated terrorist organizations like Hamas. So that's why the U.S. is considering deporting that green card holder who supports Hamas.
It really makes you think about whether foreigners should be allowed to say anything they want, even if it goes against the values of the country they're living in.
It's a really complex question. The amount of free speech that non-citizens have often depends on their residency status and the laws of the country. They're in Taiwan's Immigration Act, for example, allows them to revoke residency permits for activities that harm national interests or public order. Supporting the forceful unification of Taiwan would definitely fall under that category because it goes against Taiwan's core values of self-determination and democracy. In the U.S., they can designate people who support terrorist groups as inadmissible and deport them, even if they have green cards. Supporting Hamas, which the U.S. considers a terrorist organization, goes against their values of national security and opposition to terrorism. So basically, countries have the right to decide who can live within their borders, and they can limit the speech of non-citizens if it clashes with their fundamental values.
Okay, so if freedom of speech isn't absolute, what exactly does it mean? It sounds like it's a lot more complicated than just being able to say whatever you want.
Yeah. You're right. Freedom of speech means that people have the right to express their opinions, ideas, and beliefs without being punished by the government or by society. It's a really important part of democracy because it allows for the free exchange of ideas. It lets people hold the government accountable, and it's essential for individual dignity and freedom. But as we've seen, this right is not unlimited. There are some things you can't say without facing consequences.
So what kinds of speech are not protected?
Generally speaking, speech that directly harms others or incites violence is not protected. There's this idea called the harm principle, which basically says that your freedom should only be limited if your actions are going to hurt someone else. In a democracy, we have to balance individual rights with the well-being of the whole community.
Right.
So if your speech becomes a form of intimidation or a way to harm others, then it can be restricted. This is to protect everyone's rights and ensure that society can function peacefully.
That's definitely a balancing act. It sounds like these recent cases are sparking a lot of debate around the world about where exactly those lines should be drawn.
Definitely.
Yeah.
These cases have brought up some really important questions about how freedom of speech works for non-citizens and how to balance those rights with national security and the values of the host country. It's an ongoing discussion, and there are no easy answers.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive, even if it was a little heavy at times. So let's recap. What are the key things we should take away from our discussion about China's narratives on Taiwan, what they're trying to accomplish, and how Taiwan is responding?
The biggest takeaway is that there's a huge disconnect between what China says about Taiwan and what's actually happening there. They deny that Taiwan has a legitimate president. They downplay the growing support for Taiwanese identity, and they use threatening language while trying to present themselves as a responsible world power. But the reality is that Taiwan is a vibrant democracy with a strong sense of its own identity, and China's efforts to undermine that are having the opposite effect in many ways.
They're making Taiwan even more determined to resist.
Exactly, and Taiwan's response to all of this has been really impressive. They're working to strengthen their international alliances, build up their own defenses, and tell their story to the world. They're showing the world that they're a resilient democracy that deserves respect and support.
It's definitely a situation worth paying attention to. So here's something for our listeners to think about. As the global political landscape keeps changing, how do we balance national sovereignty, individual rights, and international relations? Especially when it comes to issues like self-determination and potential conflicts, it's a lot to consider.
For sure. It's a complex world.
And on a completely different note, if you're looking for something fun and entertaining, our friend Micky has a great YouTube channel called Mickytolife. He posts travel vlogs, whiskey unboxings, and even some of his own music.
Oh, yeah. I've seen his channel. It's really good.
Go check it out and tell him we sent you.
Yeah.
All right, that's all the time we have for today on The Deep Dive. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.